In this video, I'm going to show you 3 different ways to create realistic and stylized highlights for your Photoshop artwork. I will show you a 2-step process using hue and saturation adjustment layers that produces very dynamic and beautiful highlights, a process using special blend modes and solid color adjustment layers to create realistic highlights quickly, and a process using curves and inverse curves to create the most realistic and controllable highlights yet. Each of these has its advantages and disadvantages. Some are quicker, some are more realistic, but it's up to you to decide which is best for your artwork. For my first style of highlights, I have 2 different layers. I have my foreground element, which is my subject, who I'm going to do the highlights on, and I have my background, which is this crashed starship. You can see the light from the background is coming in this direction. I have some light rays here. So everything's coming in from the right-hand side. And I want to get highlights coming from that direction onto my subject. So the first thing I want to do in this method is to create a hue and saturation layer. And now I want that layer to clip onto the layer underneath it. So to create a clipping mask, you can press Alt or Option if you're on a Mac, and then click the layer, the hue and saturation adjustment layer, and it should clip just beneath to whatever layer is there. In this case, it's my subject layer. You can also press this button here in the hue and saturation control panel to clip it. You can see it's clipped by this little arrow that's pointing downward. So now that I have that, I'm going to come up here and I'm going to drop the lightness of everything down on just this layer. And that's going to be so that my highlights stand forward. Next thing I'm going to do is add another hue and saturation layer. I want to make sure that's clipped to the layer just below it by pressing Alt or Option and clicking, or using this button here again. And then I'm going to colorize it, and I will drag this slider until this color matches my background color, and I think that's about good. And then I'll raise the lightness of everything so that I can use this layer to make highlights. Now we'll create one more hue and saturation layer, colorize it again, drag it over till it's just about matching my background. Oh, actually I didn't clip it, so we'll clip it first. And now I can drag it to where it matches the background, colorize this even more, and that should be good to go there. So I will relabel these. This will be highlight 2. And this will be highlight 1. Now that we have our highlight layers, first thing I want to do is invert these 2 masks here. So making sure I'm clicked on the mask itself, you can press Control or Command I, and that will take that mask away. It'll invert it so everything is black. When you're dealing with masks, if everything in the mask is black, it doesn't show up. And if it's all white, if I invert it again, it's all there. So you can see here, we'll mask that out. What that's going to allow me to do is come over here and grab a brush. And now I just want to make sure I have a decent sized brush with 0% hardness. And I can control the size of my brush by holding Alt and right-clicking and dragging back and forth. That's a little tip that saves me a bunch of time. And now you can see I have foreground and background colors here that are black and white. If it's black, nothing shows up. If I press X on my keyboard, it'll change that to white. So now I'm painting in highlights where they go. So I'll press X again and just get rid of these. And then I'm going to go here to my highlight 1 layer. This is the very top layer, and these are going to be the most extreme highlights. So the edges that the light first contacts are where the highlights are going to be brightest. So I make sure I take a small brush, and I just go along these edges with that small brush. And in this case, I want these highlights to be even brighter, so I'll click on this side, and I'll raise that up even more. And then I'm just going to go along on this mask layer and paint in all the edges that have highlights on them. One thing that I like to do is, as I'm painting in my edges, I use a mouse So I keep my other hand on the X key so that I can constantly switch back and forth between my foreground and background. And so I'll paint a line in, and then I'll press X, and then I'll go through and just taper that line out until it's how I like it. If you're using a brush or a pen tablet, you can use your pen. As long as you have a brush that has pressure sensitivity on your brush, you'll be good to go. It will save you some time and make this step a lot quicker. So I'm just going to go through and get all of my edge highlights in and taper them out the way I want them to. Again, remembering that all of my light is coming in from this direction and striking over here. So I'll go through and get all of those highlights in, and then we'll be ready to move on to the second layer of highlights, which will be the softer one. So I'll get back with you as soon as I'm done with that. All right, now that we've got most of that wrapped up, we're going to move on to our second layer of highlights, which is going to be a lot softer layer. This first layer that we do is the contact highlight, so it's where the vast majority of the light catches. On this second layer, we're going to have softer highlights, so I like to change the flow of my brush down to about 15 to 20%, make it just a little bit larger, and then go over any of the areas on my mask layer that I think would have highlights on them. Now, the difference between flow and opacity for these two brush settings, you can see over here, if I paint with flow and I keep going back over something, it's going to get brighter and brighter and brighter as I continue to paint. If I undo that and instead I have 100% flow but only 15% opacity, now I can go over as many times as I want and it's not going to get brighter unless I let go of the mouse, re-click, and then go over it. And every time I re-click, it will get brighter and brighter and brighter. So that's just kind of a basics of the difference between those two. So set my opacity to 100, set my flow down to 15 to 20%. And then, like I said, I'm just going to go through here, and everywhere that I think would have a highlight, I'm going to paint these in real quick. Unlike my first layer, I tend to paint in all of these softer highlights first, and then I go back through with my mask and take away what I don't want. So I'm just going to paint all of these in real fast, and then, just like the first time, I'll press X, I'll come back in with black as my foreground color instead of white. I'll come back with black, and I'll just take this away from where I had painted it in. And I'm just going to take it away from anywhere that's darker or that needs real heavy shadows. So I'll get that done really fast, and then I'll come back when that's all finished up. Alright, now that that's done, we're just about ready to go in and do some smoke and particles and some other effects that I'll cover in a future video. So I'm just going to kind of throw those in and jump forward to the next step here. Now, once we get our particles and smoke and other effects in like that, and we're pretty close to a finished rendering, one trick that you can do is go to the highest visible layer you have and press Control Alt Shift and E, or Command Option Shift and E if you're on a Mac, and that will take a snapshot of everything that's visible. So you can see now I'm left with this one layer, and that is everything that I have been working on, all my particles, and I'll cover particles and smoke and embers and different types of bokeh and light flashes, all of that in another video, some glares. But for now, we got our particles and smoke effects in, and we've taken a snapshot of it, and that's ready that we can apply one single filter over it. I choose to do camera raw filter on almost everything I do because it gives you the most options possible. So I have this layer, I've drug it all the way to the top. I'm just going to go filter, convert it to for smart filters. This way it's a smart object and I can re-edit the filter later if I want to. And then I'll go filter, camera raw filter, and I'll play around with some of these settings and get something I like, and then I'll be back with you afterward. In our second method, we're going to be using color dodge, which is a special blending mode, and some solid color fill adjustment layers to create our highlights. These are very fast. They're not as controllable as any of the other two methods I'm going to show you, but if you need to get something done quickly, or you just want to try out a color on a subject you're doing, you can use this just to get it done in a hurry. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to come down here. I have my subject here, which is Darth Revan, and I have my background, same thing as the first example. I'm going to come and just above my subject layer, I'm going to press Control Shift N or Command Shift N if you're on a Mac, and I'm going to create a new layer. I'll call that Highlights. And then I want to clip that to my subject layer below by holding Alt and clicking here, or Option if you're on a Mac, and clip that to the layer below. And then I can grab a brush. I just want a nice big brush here. Keep its softness down to 0%. And then I'm going to grab a color from my background, the lightest color. And then I'm just going to go through. I want to make sure my flow is at 100%. And I'm just going to go through and touch everywhere that I think there are highlights in this image, or there would be highlights. So we'll just go through and paint this on really quickly. The whole point of this is to be fast with this method. So I'll paint these on everywhere I think they go. I think that's about everywhere that light would touch on this image. And now I'm going to take this layer and set it to color dodge. Like I said, this is one of the special blending modes, and the reason this matters is that you can control the projection of a layer with a special blending mode by using fill. So we talked about fill versus opacity. We have two sliders here, and this one is opacity, so this controls how much of the layer is visible at any given time. And so we want our opacity set to 100, and fill controls the projection onto the underlying layer. So you can see here, if I lower the fill, it's just going to take it out of that underlying layer as I lower it. So the more fill we have, the more it will project onto that layer, and the less fill we have, the less it'll project. We can use this in tandem with blend if, and I can access blend if by double clicking the right side of this layer and bringing up the blend if in the layer style menu. I want to choose the underlying layer, this slider here, because that's going to be the layer beneath it. And I'm just going to Alt, click on this slider, and drag it back and forth. And you can see I remove pretty much everything I don't want out of the darkest areas. The reason I hold Alt to split that is to split that slider up. If I don't, you can see it's a much harsher blending. So I hold Alt, I pull it over to just where I like it, and now you can see all of my preliminary highlights are already done. The last thing to do here is to create a solid color adjustment layer. I'll just hit OK for now. I will clip that layer to the layer underneath, and then make sure I like the color that's here. If I don't, I can double click the icon and I get a color picker, and I can just grab a color from my background. So I'll do that. And then again, I come over to this mask. I press Control or Command I if I'm on a Mac. And then I can go back through with my brush and just start painting in highlights. So I make my brush smaller, and these are just going to be all the edge highlights. So I'll paint these in real fast, and then I'll come back to you when I'm finished get some particles and the camera raw filter on this, and it should be finished and ready to go. All right, there we have it. And just like my first example, I'm going to want to come back in here really fast. And I'm just going to throw a brightness and contrast layer here. I'll make sure it is the lowest in terms of my layer stack. And then I'm going to drop the brightness of this just so that the highlights stand forward a little bit. And the reason I have it as the very lowest is that if I have this brightness and contrast layer higher, it's going to affect the other layers. So you can see if I have this here, this brightness and contrast layer here, it will make all of the highlights darker, and I don't want that. So I'll bring that down so that it's the lowest. And now for the third example, we're going to be using curves, inverse curves, and a gradient map to create super realistic highlights that match our background really well. This by far is the most exact of any of the techniques. It takes the longest, but it produces amazing realistic results. Great for realistic photo edits and for artistic ones as well. You can see I have a foreground layer, which is Rex here, and then I have a background layer, which is the same one I've been using in all the others. First thing I'm going to want to do is create a luminosity check layer. So I will come over here, I will make a black and white adjustment layer, and I'm just going to have that above both of my foreground and background layers. And what I'm going to use that for is to make sure that my darkest darks in my subject and my lightest lights match the background layer here. Here I can see that my lightest lights are a little bit too bright and my darkest darks are a little bit too dark. So I will click on my subject layer. I'm going to come down here again. I'm going to grab a curves layer. Make sure that is clipped to my subject only. Again, I can hold Alt or Option and click here, or I can use this button here to clip it. And then I'm going to want to drop my lightest lights just a little bit here. We can see that's making my whites a little bit darker, and that matches pretty well there. Then I'm going to grab this side of the curve and I'm going to pull it up just to raise the lightness of my darkest darks. And I think somewhere in there is matching my darkest darks pretty well. So now that I have something I like, I can take my luminosity layer here, my color check layer, and I can turn that off. And in fact, I'll just delete that because I don't want it in my way later. So now that we have something that's matching pretty well here, first thing I want to do is get a gradient map layer. So I'll click that, put it in here, and then I want to make sure it's clipped to my subject. So we'll clip that there. And then I want this icon, not the mask. So select the icon, and then I can click my gradient map here, and that'll bring up the gradient editor. What this is going to allow me to do is match my background really well. So you can see I have this color, which is my lightest light, and I have this color, which is my darkest dark. That's currently in here. So I can click the lightest light to change this. So I click this once, I click the color once, and then I get a color picker and I can grab here, which is my lightest light in the background, and it will match it to that. And then I grab the darkest dark, click that once, click the color once, and then I can select the darkest dark, which let's say is here, maybe over here. I like that. I hit OK. And now I have a gradient from my darkest dark to my lightest light. Now this isn't matching really well yet, so what I can do is come over here and add another slider on this scale. I click that once, I click the color once, and now I can come in and find a slightly darker blue, somewhere that's kind of in the mid-tone of that. And now I have that, and then I will add one more slider along that range and click that once, and then come over and find an even darker blue. And there we have it, something that's matching really well. This gradient goes in a smooth way from my lightest blue in the background to my darkest blue in the background. I'll hit OK to accept that. And now, by controlling the opacity, I can bring back some of my original colors so that that matches really well and incorporates my original color. So now I've toned it to my background and everything is matching pretty good. So what I'll want to do next is create a curves layer. And with this layer, again, clip it to my subject. I'm going to want to do an inverse curve. So here I can raise the lights or lower the lights. And the same, if I grab down here, I can lower my darks or raise the darks. And that's usually how we'd use curves layers. But in this instance, I'm going to grab as far over and down as I can, and I'm going to pull up from this side. And that's why it's called an inverse curve layer, because it's using the curves basically backwards from what we normally would. So I'm going to use that to raise everything, raise the lightness of everything in this layer. That way I can make a highlight layer with it. And I'm also going to come up here to channels, and I'm going to switch to the blue channel. And I will grab and do an inverse curve to raise the blue of my layer. And then I'm going to switch to the red channel, because I think this is a little more cyan than just blue. And here you can see I can add in more blue, or I can come the opposite direction and add in more cyan. So now my highlight is matching pretty well with what's going on in the background. So I will label that highlights 1. And then I'm going to create another one, another curves layer, and do an inverse curve. And I'm going to make that one brighter than the last one. Also, I'll make sure that it's clipped to the layer underneath. Again, I'll grab some blue. Make sure that that is a little bit more blue than the last one. And then grab red and add a little bit more cyan than the last one. So now I have a pretty light highlight layer and an even lighter highlight layer. So we'll call that highlights 2. And now I'm just going to do the same exact thing I did in the first 2 examples. I will first go to my highlights 1 layer. I'm going to double click on this side to bring up the blend if. Now that I have blend if, I will Alt or Option click this slider, split it apart, and just remove it from some of my blacks. Hit OK. And here we can see what it actually looks like by inverting this mask. That's looking really good. I like that. So I'll click on that mask, press Control or Command I to get rid of both of them. And now I can go through and start painting in my highlights. Same exact way I did before. Here is the softer highlight layer. Here is the harsher contact layer. So on this layer, I'll make sure I use flow at 100% and a small brush just to do the edges. Get those highlights in real nice. And then taper those off. And once I'm done with that, I'll switch to my highlight 2 layer and I'll drop the flow down to 10 to 20%. And with a larger brush, I'll go in and paint those in where I want those highlights. If you've learned something new, or even just a new way to do something old, let me know in the comments below. If you enjoy this style of content, leave a like so I know to keep making these videos, and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. And until next time, have a good one.